Hello, friends, and welcome back to the podcast. First of all, Merry Christmas. Oh, I love Christmas so much. It is my favorite holiday of the year, and I just had to throw in Christmas music for this episode. So, today is a very special episode as we wrap up the year and kind of take a look at the trends that I think are going to be important. Now, I have so much hope for the new year. I think it's going to be a great year. I really, really do. I may be totally wrong about that, and that may come back to bite me in the butt, but I really think it's going to be a good year. And I know y'all are with me when I say goodbye 2021, see you later, don't let the door hit you. You know the rest of it. But like I said, this year was full of so much. So many lessons learned. There was some grief and much more. People lost loved ones, all that kind of stuff. Before we get into the main thing I'm going to talk about today on the show, I also just want to say thank you to each and every one of you for listening, subscribing, leaving a review, sharing the podcast with others, sharing episodes with others. I truly appreciate it. Thank you to all my guests that were on the show this year. We've got lots more of that coming up in 2022. And the podcast has grown so much since I launched it in April. And each and every one of you are a direct result of that. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. I truly appreciate it. Now, it's been another remarkable year in podcasting land. And that has brought some tremendous growth in the industry. So as we wrap up 2021, it's time to ask, what next? What's waiting for us in 2022? Now, I'm not sure about everything else, but there are some things in podcasting that I'm seeing trends with. So after looking at some analytics and different industry articles, I really believe that podcasting is going to grow even faster with more advertising activity, more listener development, and even more tech changes. There's always tech changes, right? And this is great news for not only hosts, but listeners alike. So let's dive in. Okay, y'all. First, let's talk about listeners. Now, I've seen a couple of new things among especially new podcasts. As you guys know, I am an OG member of the podcasting community. I've been involved with it back. It was a newborn on the horizon back in around 2005, 2006. And I know I'm dating myself there a little bit, but one of the things that initially drew me to podcasting was the open spirit of it. When the technology became available to do this, it gave people a voice, a place to share their stories, to tell their version of the story, whether it was about their army life or special needs life or what happened to them when they were younger or whatever God put on your heart to share. You could share it. And it always has been about the listener. But I've noticed a lot with new podcast shows, they're not really paying attention to what the listener wants. So my question to you is, do you know who your listener is? Who is she? What does she do? What does she want to hear about? What are her pain points? What is her struggle? How can you help her? Now, I know not all podcasts are business related or think of their podcast in a business way. And we'll talk more about promoting your podcast a little bit later, but you need to make your podcast available to her, for her. Now, like I said, listeners have always led the way. And wherever they go, as hosts and content creators, we kind of need to follow that. All right, maybe I've watched a little too much Gilmore Girls lately. If you know, you know, right? Okay, but I've seen so many podcasts create the show for what they want. Now, if you're just getting started in launch mode, that's fine. You don't really have an audience yet, unless you have a following on social media and you know those people are going to start listening to your podcast and things like that. That's fine. You don't really have an audience yet. You're not really sure what they want. So you got to start with something, right? But once you do have that audience, you've built that community, they're listening to your show, they're downloading it, they're sharing it with others, whatever the case may be, you need to make the show for her or for him or for them. And if you don't know what she wants, ask. Do a survey. Send out an email. Ask on social. Look at your analytics. Every podcast host gives you some version of analytics, what your stats show. Anchor, Libsyn, Buzzsprout. Some do a better job than others. But if you're not getting a lot of information from that, you can always go and get a free account on Chartable, and it'll give you a lot of information. And I'm going to talk about that in future episodes. So stay tuned if you want to know more about stats and all those kinds of things. Look at what your top 10 episodes are. What are the topics that are related to that? Do you see any sort of trend with that? Like I said, and I mentioned this a lot here on the podcast, and of course with my podcast launch clients and my coaching clients, is that promoting your podcast is almost just as critical, just as essential as what your show is about. Now, there's a lot of podcasts out there right now, and you have to compete with that. I think the last time I looked, there was about 2 million or so, maybe even more now, podcasts out there. Now, that makes your discoverability one of your biggest challenges. Regardless of whether you're producing ad-supported content, or you're a subscription-based show, or it's a branded podcast, or whatever it may be, there's lots of different factors that go into that. So I talked about that this year on episode 10. So if you're really looking for more information and kind of a deeper dive on that, I did that in episode 10. So go over to tammymunsingcreative.com/episode 10, and you can hear all the details on that. The other thing I noticed this year is that we saw a lot more of the bigger players entering the game. Because with the maturing of podcasting and the maturing of any medium means that more established players with deeper financial pockets are entering the space. This ultimately will help us all grow. It isn't necessarily a bad thing. Bigger companies, bigger networks will bring big ad dollars, and that's going to further legitimize podcasting. And so we all benefit from that. Don't let that distract you, because podcasting is still for the indie podcaster. And that's one of the beautiful things about it, is that it is a space for many different voices, for many different viewpoints, different cultures. So from celebrity podcasters that are able to have wide audiences because they're a celebrity and they have a massive following, to more the indie podcasts that are very niche topics, loyal audiences, there's space for everybody. And the reason why the celebrity podcasters and the networks are jumping on the podcast bandwagon is because of the indie podcasts. They have been critical to the development of podcast popularity. So don't let that bother you, because the independent podcasts or indie podcasts are going to continue to cover ground because they can go places that celebrities necessarily can't do, or the bigger networks, due to one reason or another. Maybe they can't get into specific topics. But in order to compete with these larger players, you're going to need to find creative solutions, creative marketing methods, creative podcast promotion in order to compete. Now, another trend that I've noticed is podcasts as bonus content. Now, fiction podcasts have been on the rise, and I expect to see that grow even more in 2022. You're starting to see podcasts. NPR has been doing one for years. NBC, CBS are starting to add notable podcasts as part of their offering to their audiences. And this is within the fiction podcast space. So basically what they're doing is they're coming up with ideas. They're testing them out before they make the big investments in creating a pilot for television to see if it's going to work. And I think this is going to continue to happen. And then audiences can follow their favorite stories from podcasts to TV to film and back to podcasts. Because another trend that networks and studios are doing is making a podcast about their television show. I know Hallmark has one. I think there's the official Yellowstone podcast. There's lots of podcasts that are out there in those spaces that are all related to that latest episode, which I think is really, really very cool. And even the podcast is now being content itself for television shows. Has anyone seen a little show that happened to me called Murders in the Building? Which, great show, by the way. Highly, highly recommend. On the last episode, on the episode I did with Storytellers Live, Robin recommended it. I said that we just started watching episode 1. Well, we're now finished with that series. Absolutely fantastic. Steve Martin, Martin Short, and Selena Gomez are fabulous in it. Great, great show. Highly recommend it. I have a few issues as a podcast producer, but I'll talk about that in another episode. Now, another big thing that's been on the horizon for the last few years, it really made a big jump this year, was subscriptions. Apple came out with one. Spotify came out with one. Lots of different networks have them. Patreon has been around for years. And lots of podcasters are starting to utilize it. Now, I've talked about how I liked it. I thought it was a good idea. But the thing is, subscriptions are not for everyone. So you really need to look at your marketing efforts and who you're talking to, and will a subscription work for your podcast? Like I said, it's a great way to monetize a podcast, but not for every single podcast out there. Now, for me personally, I love the free nature of podcasting. Like I said earlier, I'm an OG, y'all. So for me personally, if you're going to make me subscribe in order to get a podcast, I'm probably not going to do that. But if you're offering me some sort of additional content, you're still giving me a podcast, but then you're also giving me something a little bit extra that I can't get anywhere else, then I'm most likely to subscribe. And I think a lot of listeners out there are of that same thought process. Removing barriers to access is how most podcasters can make the biggest impact with their content. So like I said, I think subscriptions are perfect for the right audience. Like, for example, my friends over at Storytellers Live, they have their podcasts, and then they have their Patreon community. And you get really amazing, deeper dive content that you're not going to always get on the podcast because there just isn't time and the format in which they do it. Now, if you're thinking about doing a paid subscription in 2022, the podcast that will have the highest probability of this working for them is going to be either a podcast or a network that has a sizable existing audience. They've been doing a show for years. They've got hundreds of hours of content available, a large following, or a very, very targeted niche audience with listeners willing to pay for specialized content. And there's not a competitor already producing similar free content. Because if it's already out there, nobody's going to buy it. There's got to be something special about it, right? And this is exactly what Storytellers Live does. And it works very, very well for them and their ministry. So advertising on podcasts has been coming around for probably the last 5-6 years now. And not only is it getting bigger, it's also getting better. So there's been a significant increase in demand for strategic advertising on podcasts that deliver measurable results. And advertisers are starting to realize that this engagement, this specific targeting, and the effectiveness of podcast advertising, we can probably expect in 2022 that this type of spending with brands is going to increase significantly. Now, one of the things with advertising is there's currently 2 types of advertising. And what we've seen for many, many years has been what we call baked-in ads. The ads are created, they're put in directly into the file gets uploaded, you listen, and it stays there and it lives there forever. Well, that can mean that if you go back and you're listening to episode 45 and you're now on episode 112, that ad may be very outdated, especially if it refers to like a sale or a book or something to that effect. So one of the things that I really like, and I've talked about it on one of the podcast information roundup that we did earlier this year, was about utilizing dynamic content. Now, Buzzsprout has created something that will help that, so that you can put in an ad. It's not a baked in ad. It's just stitched into the file. It's a software that's used with Buzzsprout. And if you want to change it out, you can change it out. You don't lose anything. It stays in the library. Now, to find out more about that, I want you to go over to tammymunsingcreative.com/Buzzsprout. It'll take you directly to all the information on their page, and you can find out lots more about it. It's really, really cool technology. And no worries, y'all. I'm going to do a deep, deep dive on it in January 2022. As far as podcasting goes, it's going to be interesting to see how much it's going to grow in 2022, because it's been growing by leaps and bounds over the past few years. And with Google focusing on video and audio-based content in their search algorithm, as well as Instagram making changes with their algorithm and focusing more on the video stuff, it's safe to say that there are some big things ahead for podcasting. So stay tuned, more on that. Now, so there is no new episode next week because I will be celebrating with my family down in my awesome hometown of New Orleans, Louisiana. Gonna be hanging out with my dad and some friends, and hopefully be able to hang out with a client or two that lives down there. But I will be back with a brand new episode on January 3rd. And that episode is going to be about creating an accessible podcast. So it's going to be all about how you can make your podcast accessible for the special needs community. Now, a lot of you know that my oldest daughter does have some special needs, and I've spent a lot of time working with special needs educators and special needs therapists to really kind of help those folks have access to podcasts. I talk a lot about the transcripts on your podcast, but there's lots of other things also that you can do. So tune into that episode. That'll air on January 3rd. Now, ladies, I believe in each and every one of you. Remember, God has equipped each and every one of us with everything that we need to step into His calling for us. You can do this. I have faith in you, and I believe that you can do exactly what God has planned for you. May this Christmas be the brightest and most wonderful Christmas of your life. May you find the peace and the joy that you've been looking for. And the angel said to them, "Fear not, for behold, I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all people." Merry Christmas, y'all. Have a great rest of 2021, and I will see you January 3rd, 2022. Bye, y'all.